Sometimes the person everyone thinks doesn't belong in the room is the one who built the room in the first place. That was a sentence Laura Bennett had heard once, years ago, though on that bright Saturday afternoon she had no idea how perfectly it would describe the moment she was about to step into. The open house sat on a quiet street lined with tall maple trees just beginning to show hints of early fall color, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns looked freshly trimmed every morning and the mailboxes all matched like they had been planned that way. The home itself was a large white colonial with wide front steps and black shutters, the kind of house that looked like it belonged in a real estate magazine. A polished wooden sign stood near the curb with a simple message printed across the top: "Open house, today only." Several cars were parked along the street, including a dark blue SUV that Laura had ridden in only minutes earlier. Her daughter Sophie Bennett stepped out first, smoothing the front of her light sweater and glancing toward the house with the focused excitement of someone imagining a different life. Sophie was 26, ambitious, recently promoted at her marketing firm, and convinced that buying the right home would be the beginning of something bigger. Laura stepped out of the passenger side a second later, closing the door gently and taking a quiet look around the street. She noticed small details automatically: the spacing between the houses, the fresh coat of paint on the porch railing, the landscaping around the walkway leading to the front door. Sophie had already started walking toward the house when she turned back and said, "Come on, Mom. The open house probably already started." Laura smiled and followed a few steps behind. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway as a few other visitors walked inside ahead of them, couples speaking quietly, someone laughing near the front porch. The open front door revealed a bright entryway inside with soft music playing somewhere deeper in the house. Just before they reached the steps, Sophie slowed slightly and glanced sideways at her mother. "By the way," she said casually, lowering her voice a little, "when we go in there, just let me do the talking, okay?" Laura raised an eyebrow, though she kept her tone calm. "The talking about what?" Sophie gave a quick smile that felt polite but slightly tense. "You know, about the house. The agent will probably ask questions about financing and all that. I just don't want things to get confusing." Laura nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely sure what Sophie meant. "All right," she said gently. They stepped onto the wide wooden porch where a small table had been set up near the door with brochures neatly arranged in a fan shape. Inside the foyer, sunlight streamed through a large front window, reflecting off the polished hardwood floor. A tall man in a navy blazer stood near the staircase speaking with another couple, holding a tablet and gesturing toward the living room as he explained something about the property. Sophie leaned slightly toward Laura and whispered, "That must be the agent." The couple finished their conversation and moved deeper into the house, leaving the agent free to greet the next visitors. As Sophie and Laura stepped inside, the man looked up with a professional smile. "Good afternoon," he said warmly. "Welcome to the open house." Sophie immediately stepped half a pace forward, her voice bright and confident. "Hi, we're just taking a look around." Then she added quickly, gesturing toward Laura without quite meeting her eyes, "She's just tagging along with me." The words were casual, almost playful, but Laura felt the subtle shift in the air the moment they were spoken. The agent gave a polite nod toward Laura anyway, though his attention returned to Sophie as if she were the one making the decisions. "Of course," he said. "Feel free to explore. The kitchen is straight ahead, and the primary suite is upstairs if you'd like to see the full layout." Sophie thanked him and began walking toward the living room, her steps a little quicker now, already scanning the space as if picturing furniture placements and color palettes. Laura followed at a slower pace, her eyes moving across the walls, the staircase railing, the soft curve of the hallway that led toward the kitchen. The house smelled faintly of fresh paint and lemon cleaner, the scent of a place being prepared for new beginnings. Sophie's voice echoed lightly from the next room as she commented on the size of the windows, and somewhere behind them another couple stepped through the front door, murmuring quietly to each other. Laura paused near the base of the staircase for a moment, resting her hand gently against the smooth wood of the railing as she looked around. The room was bright, welcoming, carefully staged to impress. And yet something about the space felt strangely familiar in a way she couldn't quite explain. She let her hand slide off the railing and continued walking toward the living room where Sophie was already speaking enthusiastically about square footage and resale value, completely unaware that the quiet woman who had supposedly come along just to watch might understand this house far better than anyone else in the room. The living room opened wide and bright in front of them, sunlight pouring through a row of tall windows that looked out toward the quiet street, and Sophie immediately stepped farther inside as if she were already imagining where her couch might go or how a large television might look against the far wall. "This space is actually bigger than I expected," she said, turning slowly while scanning the room with the focused curiosity of someone evaluating every corner. Laura followed a few steps behind, her pace calm and unhurried, taking in the same details but for entirely different reasons. The hardwood floor had a warm honey color, recently polished, and the crown molding near the ceiling had been repainted in a crisp white that contrasted nicely with the soft beige walls. Sophie walked toward the windows and looked out across the front lawn. "The natural light is amazing," she said, almost to herself. "That is something people always look for when they buy." Laura nodded quietly. "It does make a difference." Sophie continued speaking as though she were already discussing the home with a potential client rather than standing inside it as a visitor. "If the price is even close to reasonable, this place could be a really good investment," she said. "The neighborhood alone probably adds a lot of value." As they moved toward the wide opening that led into the kitchen, Laura noticed the careful staging placed throughout the house. A simple vase of white flowers rested on a coffee table near the sofa, and a soft throw blanket had been folded neatly across one arm of the couch to make the space feel warm and inviting. Everything had been arranged with intention. In the kitchen, several other visitors had gathered near a long marble island where a tray of small bottled waters and wrapped cookies had been placed for guests. The room smelled faintly of vanilla and fresh wood. Sophie reached for a brochure sitting near the edge of the counter and began scanning the information printed inside. "For bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms," she read quietly. 3,200 square feet. She glanced up toward the tall cabinets and stainless steel appliances. "Not bad." Laura stepped closer to the island and rested her hand lightly against the smooth marble surface. The stone was cool to the touch. She looked around slowly, noticing the layout of the cabinets, the placement of the stove, the view through the back window that looked toward a fenced yard. A faint smile touched her face for just a moment before fading again. Sophie turned a page of the brochure. "Built about 8 years ago," she said. "That means it should still be in pretty good condition." She looked over her shoulder at Laura and added with a slightly apologetic tone, "Sorry if this is boring. Real estate stuff can get kind of technical." Laura gave a small laugh. "You would be surprised how interesting it can be." Sophie seemed distracted by something across the room before she could respond. The real estate agent from the foyer had entered the kitchen and was now speaking with another couple near the dining area. He moved easily through the conversation, answering questions with the calm confidence of someone who knew the property well. After a moment, his eyes briefly shifted toward Laura and Sophie before returning to the couple he was assisting. Sophie leaned closer to the island again, lowering her voice slightly. "He seems professional," she said. "That is a good sign. Some agents just try to rush people through a tour." Laura watched the man for another second as he finished his conversation. There was a flicker of recognition in his expression when his eyes moved across the room again, but it was subtle enough that Sophie did not notice. The couple he had been speaking with thanked him and moved toward the staircase, leaving the kitchen momentarily quieter. Sophie straightened and glanced around again with renewed excitement. "If the upstairs bedrooms are as nice as this kitchen, I might actually consider putting in an offer," she said. "It would be a big step, but sometimes you have to take chances." Laura studied the layout of the room once more before speaking. "A house always tells a story," she said gently. "Sometimes you just have to pay attention to what it is saying." Sophie smiled politely, though she clearly did not understand the meaning behind the comment. At that moment, the agent began walking toward them with the same calm smile he had shown every visitor that afternoon. Sophie quickly set the brochure down and turned to face him with professional enthusiasm. "Hi again," she said. "We were just talking about how beautiful the kitchen is." The man nodded. "It is definitely one of the highlights of the home." Then his gaze moved briefly to Laura again, lingering a fraction longer this time as though he were searching his memory for something he could almost remember. Laura met his eyes calmly, her expression neutral but observant. Sophie did not notice the quiet exchange unfolding between them because she had already begun asking about property taxes, homeowners association fees, and whether the seller was accepting offers yet. The agent answered each question politely, but even as he spoke his attention kept drifting back to Laura, as if some small detail about her presence in that house felt strangely familiar in a way he could not quite explain. The agent rested one hand lightly against the edge of the marble island while answering Sophie's questions with practiced ease, his tone calm and professional as he explained the estimated property taxes, the annual homeowners association fee, and the recent upgrades made by the current seller. Sophie listened carefully, nodding as though she were mentally calculating every number he mentioned. Laura stood quietly beside her, observing the exchange without interrupting. The agent's name tag caught the light for a moment, revealing the name Michael Turner printed in clean silver letters. Sophie flipped through the brochure again and asked another question about the backyard. Is it fully fenced, or is that something the next owner would need to add? Michael replied without hesitation. It is fully enclosed already, just under a quarter-acre in total. There is also a small patio area behind the kitchen that many buyers like, because it connects directly to the living space. Sophie seemed impressed by the answer. That is actually perfect, she said. Outdoor space is becoming more important for resale value. Michael nodded politely, but once again his eyes drifted toward Laura for a brief moment before returning to Sophie. It was not the glance of someone simply acknowledging another visitor. It was more thoughtful than that, as if he were quietly examining a puzzle piece that almost fit somewhere in his memory. Laura noticed the look but said nothing. Instead, she walked a few slow steps across the kitchen and paused near the window that overlooked the backyard. The grass outside was neatly trimmed, and a pair of tall oak trees stood near the fence line, casting long shadows across the lawn. Sophie continued speaking behind her. Do you know if the seller is motivated to close quickly? She asked. Michael responded with a measured tone. The seller is open to serious offers, but they are not in a hurry. They are mainly looking for the right buyer. Sophie nodded again and leaned slightly closer to the island, lowering her voice just enough that it sounded more confidential. That usually means there might be some room for negotiation. Michael smiled politely but did not immediately agree or disagree. Instead, he said, every situation is different, but buyers who truly appreciate the property tend to have the best outcomes. Laura turned slightly from the window, her gaze moving across the room again with quiet attention. There were details in the space that most visitors probably overlooked, small design choices that reflected careful planning rather than simple decoration. The placement of the cabinets, the flow between the kitchen and living area, even the height of the ceiling beams created a feeling of balance that was difficult to describe unless someone had once been involved in the decisions themselves. Sophie walked toward the stainless steel refrigerator and opened one of the cabinet doors briefly, as though she were already imagining herself living there. The storage space is impressive, she said. Michael nodded. That is one of the features many people mention during tours. Then he looked toward Laura again, this time with a slightly more direct curiosity. What do you think about the layout? He asked. Sophie glanced at her mother quickly, as if surprised the question had been directed her way. Laura remained calm. It flows nicely, she said. The transition between rooms feels natural. Michael studied her expression for a moment longer than necessary. That is exactly how it was described when the house was first built, he said thoughtfully. Sophie laughed lightly, assuming it was just a general comment. Well, whoever designed it knew what they were doing. Michael gave a polite smile, though his attention still seemed partly fixed on Laura. Across the room, another couple entered the kitchen, speaking quietly to each other while examining the countertop and looking toward the backyard. The open house was slowly becoming busier as more visitors arrived. Sophie noticed the growing crowd and turned back toward the agent. Do you mind if we take a look upstairs? She asked. I would love to see the bedrooms before it gets too crowded. Michael gestured toward the staircase visible through the living room. Of course. The primary suite is at the end of the hallway, and there are 3 additional bedrooms on the second floor. Sophie thanked him and started walking toward the living room again with renewed enthusiasm. Laura followed at a slower pace, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. As they passed through the living area, she glanced once more toward the staircase and the upper hallway beyond it. The house felt strangely familiar again in a way that lingered just beneath the surface of memory. Behind them, Michael watched the two women for a moment before turning back to greet another group entering the kitchen. Yet even as he welcomed the new visitors, the thoughtful look remained in his eyes, as though he was beginning to realize that the quiet woman who had supposedly come along simply to watch might know far more about that house than she had revealed so far. Sophie walked ahead toward the staircase with the confident pace of someone already imagining herself living inside the house, her hand briefly gliding along the polished wooden railing as she started climbing the steps. The staircase curved gently upward, opening into a bright second-floor hallway where sunlight filtered through a wide window at the far end. Laura followed a few steps behind, moving more slowly as her eyes traced the familiar lines of the architecture. The soft creak of the wooden steps beneath her feet sounded almost exactly the same as she remembered. Sophie reached the top first and turned left into the hallway, immediately peeking into the first bedroom. "This would make a great office," she said enthusiastically, stepping inside and looking around. The room was neatly staged with a small desk, a simple bookshelf, and a framed landscape painting hanging above a neutral-colored chair. The sunlight pouring through the window made the space feel bright and open. Sophie walked to the center of the room and turned in a slow circle, mentally measuring the size of the space. "You could easily fit a full desk setup in here," she continued, speaking as if she were explaining her thoughts out loud. Laura stepped into the doorway and observed quietly. The room felt almost unchanged except for the furniture. She glanced toward the closet door, and then toward the window frame where a faint line in the paint revealed where something had once been mounted years earlier. Sophie had already moved on. "Let us see the next one," she said, stepping back into the hallway with renewed energy. They walked a few steps down to the second bedroom, slightly larger than the first and decorated with soft neutral bedding. Sophie ran her fingers lightly across the edge of the bedspread as she examined the room. "This could be a guest room," she said thoughtfully, "or maybe a studio space." Laura nodded politely while looking around the corners of the room. The ceiling height, the placement of the door, the distance between the window and the wall all felt strangely precise to her memory. Sophie stepped back into the hallway again and looked toward the end where the primary suite waited behind a larger double door. "That must be the main bedroom," she said with excitement. As they approached the door, Laura noticed a small decorative table placed along the hallway wall holding a glass bowl filled with white stones. She paused for just a second, glancing at the spot where the table stood, and a quiet expression crossed her face as though she remembered something that used to sit there long ago. Sophie pushed open the double doors to the primary bedroom and walked inside with a soft gasp of appreciation. The room was spacious, with tall windows overlooking the backyard and a wide bed positioned against the far wall. A sitting area with two armchairs had been arranged near the windows, and a soft rug covered the center of the hardwood floor. "This is beautiful," Sophie said, her voice filled with excitement. She walked toward the window and looked out across the yard where the oak trees cast long shadows over the grass. "Imagine waking up to that view every morning," she added. Laura stepped into the room and looked around slowly, her eyes moving from the window to the ceiling beams and then to the doorway leading toward the private bathroom. She did not say anything, but there was a quiet understanding in her expression that Sophie did not notice. Sophie turned around again, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. "If the price is within reach, this place could be perfect," she said. "It is big enough to grow into, but not so big that it feels overwhelming." Laura walked toward the sitting area near the windows and rested her hand briefly on the back of one of the chairs. The fabric was new, carefully chosen to match the neutral design of the house, but the position of the chairs felt almost identical to where another pair had once been placed years earlier. Sophie continued exploring the room, opening the door to the walk-in closet, and then peeking into the bathroom where a large soaking tub and glass shower reflected the afternoon light. "This bathroom alone could sell the house," she said with a laugh. At that moment footsteps approached in the hallway outside, and a moment later Michael Turner appeared at the open doorway. He stood there politely, allowing Sophie a moment to finish looking around before speaking. "It is one of the most popular rooms during the tours," he said calmly. Sophie smiled at him with genuine excitement. "I can see why." Michael nodded but then looked toward Laura again with that same thoughtful expression that had followed him since the kitchen. His gaze moved slowly around the room, then back to her, as if he were finally starting to connect the quiet sense of familiarity that had been building in his mind since the moment she walked through the front door. Michael remained standing at the doorway of the primary bedroom with a calm professional posture, though the thoughtful look in his eyes had grown more noticeable. Sophie was still admiring the space, walking from the window to the center of the room as she spoke with bright enthusiasm. "This layout really works," she said. "The bedroom feels private, but still connected to the rest of the house." Michael nodded slightly. That was one of the goals when the property was first designed. Sophie smiled as if she agreed completely, though she had not considered who might have been involved in those early decisions. Laura stood near the sitting area by the windows, her gaze drifting across the ceiling beams and then toward the hallway outside. The quiet familiarity she felt in the house had grown stronger with every room they visited, though she continued to say very little. Sophie turned back toward Michael again with another question. "How long has the house been on the market?" she asked. Michael stepped a little farther into the room so that he could answer more comfortably. "Just over 3 weeks," he said. "There has been steady interest, especially during the open houses." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. Properties like this do not stay available very long." She glanced toward the bathroom door again, still clearly impressed by what she had seen there. "I would imagine a lot of people have already made offers." Michael gave a small polite smile. "There have been inquiries, but nothing finalized yet." Sophie seemed encouraged by that answer. She crossed her arms lightly while studying the room once more, as if trying to picture her own life unfolding there. Meanwhile, Michael's attention slowly shifted back toward Laura. For several seconds he said nothing, simply observing her expression as she looked around the space with quiet awareness. Finally he spoke in a calm but curious tone. "Do you mind if I ask you something?" Laura turned slightly toward him. "Of course." Michael hesitated for a moment as if choosing his words carefully. "Have you ever visited this house before?" The question caught Sophie slightly off guard. She looked between the two of them with mild confusion. "Before today," she said. Laura answered calmly. "A long time ago." Michael studied her face again, as though the answer confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. Sophie laughed lightly, assuming the comment was simply nostalgic. "Well, I guess a lot of houses start to look similar after you have seen enough of them," she said. "Maybe that is why it feels familiar." Laura gave a gentle smile but did not agree or disagree. Michael glanced toward the hallway and then back into the room. More visitors could be heard moving through the house downstairs, their voices faintly echoing up the staircase as the open house continued to grow busier. Sophie stepped closer to the window again and looked down toward the backyard where the oak trees swayed lightly in the afternoon breeze. "The yard is a great size too," she said. "Big enough for gatherings but still manageable." Laura followed her gaze outside. The sunlight stretched across the grass in long golden lines that reached almost to the fence. The sight stirred another quiet memory, though she kept it to herself. Michael shifted his weight slightly and spoke again, this time directing the question more clearly toward Laura. "What do you think about the neighborhood?" he asked. "It has changed quite a bit over the years." Laura looked back at him with a calm expression. "Some changes are good," she said, "but the bones of a place usually stay the same." Michael nodded slowly, absorbing the comment. Sophie, however, seemed more focused on practical details. She turned away from the window and faced him again with a thoughtful expression. "If someone wanted to move quickly on this house, what would the process look like?" she asked. Michael answered professionally, explaining the typical steps involved in submitting an offer, scheduling inspections, and working toward a closing date. Sophie listened carefully, clearly imagining what it might take to become the new owner. Laura remained near the window, quiet and observant as always. Yet the longer Michael stood there, the more certain he seemed to become that the quiet woman who had supposedly come along simply to watch understood something about the house that no one else in the room had realized yet. The thought lingered in his mind even as he continued explaining the buying process to Sophie, and for the first time since the tour began he found himself wondering whether the story of that house might be far more personal for Laura Bennett than it appeared. Sophie continued asking questions about closing timelines and financing options while standing near the center of the primary bedroom, her voice energetic and hopeful as she imagined what it might feel like to own a home like this. Michael answered each question carefully. explaining the process in clear detail, while maintaining the same calm professionalism he had shown since the beginning of the open house. Yet every few seconds his eyes drifted back toward Laura as if the quiet certainty growing in his mind had not yet fully settled into a clear conclusion. Laura remained by the window looking out over the backyard where the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the grass in long golden patterns. She had not interrupted the conversation, but there was a thoughtful calm in her expression as though the house was quietly telling her a story that no one else in the room could hear. Sophie finally stepped away from the window area and looked toward the hallway again. "Should we see the rest of the upstairs before we head down?" she asked. Michael nodded politely. "Of course. There is one more bedroom at the end of the hall, and a shared bathroom just beside it." Sophie led the way out of the primary suite, her excitement returning as she stepped into the hallway again. Laura followed behind her at the same measured pace she had kept throughout the tour. The final bedroom was slightly smaller but still bright, with a single window facing the side of the house and a small closet built neatly into the wall. Sophie stepped inside and glanced around quickly. "This would probably work well as a guest room or maybe a nursery someday," she said casually before turning toward the hallway again. The bathroom next door had white tile floors and a simple vanity with a wide mirror that reflected the afternoon light. Sophie nodded approvingly. "It is simple but clean," she said. Michael stood just outside the doorway while she looked around, his posture relaxed yet attentive. Laura paused briefly in the hallway, her eyes resting on a small section of the wall near the staircase where the paint looked slightly newer than the surrounding surface. For a moment she seemed to remember exactly what had once hung there before the house was renovated. Sophie stepped back into the hallway again and stretched her arms lightly as if satisfied with what she had seen. "I think we have covered everything up here," she said. "The house is definitely impressive." Michael smiled politely and gestured toward the staircase. "Would you like to head back downstairs? There are still a few areas we did not spend much time in." Sophie agreed immediately. "Yes, I would like to look at the living room again now that I know the full layout." She started down the stairs first, her footsteps echoing softly through the open space as voices from the first floor grew louder with the arrival of new visitors. Laura followed more slowly, one hand resting lightly against the smooth wooden railing as she descended. The moment her foot touched the last step, she glanced across the foyer where a few people were examining the brochures on the small entry table. The house felt busier now, filled with quiet conversations and the soft shuffle of footsteps moving from room to room. Sophie walked back into the living room and stood near the center again, studying the space with renewed focus. "It feels even bigger from down here," she said. "Sometimes upstairs bedrooms can make a house feel smaller, but this one still feels open." Michael stepped beside her and nodded. The layout was designed to create that effect. Sophie turned toward the kitchen again, clearly picturing how daily life might unfold there. "Honestly, I can already imagine living here," she said with a laugh. Laura entered the living room a few seconds later and paused near the staircase, quietly observing the scene as more visitors walked through the front door. Michael noticed her again, and this time the recognition in his eyes seemed almost complete, though he still hesitated to say anything directly. Sophie walked toward the kitchen doorway, glancing back at him as she spoke. "If someone wanted to make a strong offer today, would that be possible?" Michael answered carefully. "Offers can certainly be submitted at any time." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. Meanwhile, Laura walked slowly across the living room toward the fireplace where a simple framed photograph had been placed on the mantel as part of the staging. She looked at it briefly before turning back toward the center of the room. The house had grown lively with visitors, but in that moment the quiet understanding between her and Michael seemed to stand apart from the rest of the noise. And although Sophie had not noticed yet, the story of that house was moving steadily toward a moment that would soon change the way she saw the entire afternoon. Sophie stood near the kitchen entrance with the brochure still in her hand, flipping it open again as she tried to imagine what the next steps might look like if she decided to pursue the house seriously. The voices of other visitors filled the background as small groups moved through the living room and hallway, each person forming their own quiet opinions about the property. A young couple stepped into the dining area while another visitor examined the framed photographs arranged on the living room shelves. The open house had reached its busiest moment of the afternoon. Michael Turner remained beside the living room area, answering occasional questions from nearby guests, but his attention kept drifting back toward Laura Bennett. The recognition that had slowly been forming in his mind now felt almost certain, though he had not yet spoken the thought out loud. Laura stood near the fireplace, calmly observing the room as if she were simply another visitor appreciating the house. Her expression was relaxed and thoughtful, and she seemed completely comfortable standing quietly while the energy of the open house continued around her. Sophie finally closed the brochure and walked back toward the center of the living room where Michael stood. "This place really does check most of the boxes," she said with a hopeful tone. "Location, space, natural light. It is hard to find all of that together." Michael nodded politely. "That is one of the reasons it has attracted so much attention." Sophie glanced toward the kitchen again and then toward the staircase, still thinking through the possibilities. "If someone made a serious offer soon, do you think the seller would consider it quickly?" she asked. Michael responded carefully. "Strong offers usually receive prompt attention." Sophie seemed satisfied with the answer and nodded thoughtfully. Meanwhile, Laura stepped away from the fireplace and slowly walked toward the front foyer where the entry table held the brochures and sign-in sheet for visitors. She looked down at the familiar layout of the entrance area for a moment before gently touching the edge of the table, as if confirming something only she understood. Michael noticed the movement immediately. The last pieces of the puzzle in his memory finally settled into place. The house, the details of the layout, the way Laura had looked at each room not with curiosity but with quiet recognition. He excused himself briefly from the small group of visitors who had been asking about the backyard and walked calmly across the living room toward the foyer. Sophie did not notice at first because she had started reading the brochure again, but several other visitors watched with mild curiosity as the agent approached Laura directly. Michael stopped a few steps away from her and spoke with a respectful tone that carried just enough clarity for those nearby to hear. "Excuse me," he said politely. Laura looked up from the entry table and met his eyes with calm understanding. For a brief moment neither of them spoke, though the quiet pause seemed to hold more meaning than the surrounding conversations filling the house. Michael reached into the pocket of his blazer and pulled out a small set of keys attached to a simple metal ring. The sound of the keys lightly touching each other caught Sophie's attention, and she looked up just as Michael stepped forward and extended them toward Laura. His voice was warm but formal when he finally spoke the words that had been waiting since the moment she walked through the door. "Welcome back, Miss Bennett." The sentence hung in the air like a sudden shift in gravity. Sophie blinked in confusion, glancing between the two of them as though she had misheard something. A few nearby visitors paused their conversations as well, sensing that an unexpected moment had just unfolded in the middle of the open house. Laura accepted the keys with a calm, almost nostalgic smile, turning them gently in her hand as she looked at the familiar shape of the house key. Sophie took a step closer, her voice uncertain. "Wait, what do you mean welcome back?" she asked. Michael looked at her kindly before answering. "Your mother used to own this house." The words landed softly but carried a weight that changed the atmosphere of the entire room. Sophie stared at her mother in disbelief as the realization slowly began to settle across her expression, while the quiet woman who had supposedly been tagging along simply held the keys and looked around the house with the calm recognition of someone who had once called it home. Sophie stood frozen for a moment as the quiet conversation of the open house slowly resumed around them, but the noise of other visitors now sounded distant in her ears. Her eyes moved from the small set of keys resting in her mother's hand to Michael Turner's calm expression, and then back to Laura Bennett again. The words he had spoken continued to echo in her mind, as if they had changed the meaning of the entire afternoon. "You used to own this house?" Sophie finally asked, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Laura looked down briefly at the keys before lifting her eyes toward her daughter with the same calm expression she had held throughout the visit. "A long time ago," she said gently. Sophie shook her head slightly, trying to understand how this could be something she had never heard before. "But you never told me that," she said. Michael stepped slightly to the side to give them space, though several nearby visitors were quietly observing the unexpected moment that had unfolded in the foyer. Laura turned the key ring slowly between her fingers, the familiar shape of the metal catching the light from the front window. "This was one of the first houses I ever bought," she said. Sophie blinked again in surprise. "You bought it?" she repeated. Laura nodded once. "Yes. The simple answer seemed to raise even more questions in Sophie's mind. She had always known her mother had worked in business for many years, but the quiet scale of what Laura had accomplished had never fully been explained. Sophie took a slow breath and looked around the foyer as if seeing the house differently for the first time. The living room, the staircase, the kitchen she had admired earlier suddenly felt less like a discovery and more like a chapter from a story that had started long before she arrived that afternoon. Michael spoke again with a respectful tone. "Your mother was one of the earliest investors in this neighborhood development," he explained calmly. "Back when the houses here were first being built." Sophie turned toward him with wide eyes. "Wait, you mean before the neighborhood was even finished?" Michael nodded. "That is correct. This house was part of the first group completed on this street." Sophie looked back at Laura again, clearly struggling to connect this new information with the quiet person she had assumed was simply accompanying her on a casual visit. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked softly. Laura leaned lightly against the edge of the entry table. Her posture relaxed even as several visitors nearby pretended not to listen too closely. "Because it was a long time ago," she said, "and life moved on." Sophie let out a small breath as she looked toward the living room again, remembering how confidently she had spoken earlier about the property's value and investment potential while her mother had simply listened. The realization made her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She remembered the moment at the door when she had casually told the agent that her mother was just tagging along. At the time, the words had felt harmless. Now they sounded different in her memory. Michael glanced politely toward Laura once more before speaking again. "When I started working with this property listing, I spent some time reading the early development records for the neighborhood," he explained. "Your name appeared in the documents connected to this house." Laura smiled slightly at the memory. "That was many years ago," she said, "back when this street was still mostly empty land." Sophie looked out the front window toward the quiet row of homes stretching along the tree-lined street. The neighborhood she had admired only an hour earlier now seemed to hold a deeper history than she had imagined. She turned back toward her mother with a thoughtful expression. "So you helped build this place before anyone else wanted to live here?" she said slowly. Laura shrugged gently. "Someone had to believe in it first." The answer was simple, but it carried a quiet confidence that Sophie had never fully noticed before. Around them, the open house continued with soft conversations and footsteps moving through the rooms. But for Sophie, the entire afternoon had shifted into something much more personal than a simple property tour. The conversations around the open house slowly returned to normal, but for Sophie the atmosphere still felt different, as if the entire house had quietly shifted into a place filled with memories she had never known existed. She stood beside her mother in the foyer, looking once more at the set of keys resting in Laura Bennett's hand. The small metal ring glinted under the afternoon light from the front window, and Sophie realized that those keys were more than just a simple prop for a real estate tour. They represented a chapter of her mother's life that she had never taken the time to understand. Sophie exhaled slowly and glanced toward the living room where other visitors continued walking through the house with the same curiosity she had shown earlier. But now everything felt different. She turned back toward Laura with a softer expression. "I feel like I just walked into a story that started long before I got here," she said quietly. Laura smiled gently, not with pride but with the calm understanding that time often reveals things in its own way. "Every place has a story," she replied. "Sometimes we only see the beginning or the end." Sophie looked around the foyer again, noticing small details she had overlooked earlier. The staircase railing, the wide living room entrance, even the placement of the entry table suddenly felt like pieces of something much larger. She remembered how confidently she had evaluated the house earlier, talking about investment potential and resale value, while her mother had simply listened. The memory made her shake her head slightly. "I cannot believe I told him you were just tagging along," she said with an embarrassed laugh that carried more humility than humor. Laura placed the keys gently on the entry table for a moment, the quiet sound drawing Sophie's attention again. "You did not mean anything by it," she said calmly. Sophie looked down at the keys and then back at her mother. "Still," she said softly, "I should have known better." Michael Turner stood nearby, giving them respectful space while occasionally greeting new visitors entering the house. When he noticed their conversation winding down, He stepped forward again with the same professional warmth he had shown throughout the afternoon. "If either of you would like to spend a little more time looking around, please feel free," he said politely. Sophie nodded politely, though her thoughts were clearly somewhere else. "Thank you," she said. Laura picked up the keys again and turned them once more in her hand before placing them back on the table where Michael had first offered them. "They belong to the next owner now," she said calmly. Michael nodded with understanding and returned the keys to his pocket. Sophie watched the exchange quietly, realizing that the house was no longer simply a property to consider buying. It was a place that had once been part of her mother's journey long before Sophie had begun thinking about her own future. After a moment, Sophie looked toward the front door where the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the porch outside. "Do you want to head out?" she asked gently. Laura nodded once. Together they stepped toward the door while the open house continued behind them with its steady flow of visitors. As they walked down the porch steps, Sophie paused for a moment and looked back at the house one more time. The tall windows reflected the golden light of the setting sun, and the quiet street felt peaceful in a way that made the entire afternoon seem almost reflective. Sophie turned toward her mother with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said slowly, "I spent the whole tour trying to decide if this house was worth investing in." Laura smiled softly as they walked toward the car parked along the curb. "And what did you decide?" she asked. Sophie looked back at the house one last time before answering. "I think the real investment was believing in it before anyone else did," she said. Laura gave a quiet nod of agreement as they reached the car, the calm confidence in her expression reflecting years of experience that Sophie was only beginning to understand. And as the evening light settled across the neighborhood, Sophie realized that the most important thing she had discovered that day was not the value of a house, but the depth of the quiet strength her mother had carried all along.